All right, so today we're diving headfirst into some pretty intense stuff.
Yeah, no kidding.
We're talking about the UK and Iraq.
The years leading up to the 2003 invasion.
Which, I mean...
Huge, obviously.
Exactly. But what makes this deep dive so fascinating is that we're going off of declassified UK government documents.
We're talking internal debates.
Disagreements, the whole shebang.
Offering a really rare look behind the curtain.
At a time when, let's be real, the whole world had its eyes on the U.S. and this whole war on terror thing.
And these aren't just any documents. We're talking about the findings from the UK's official Iraq inquiry.
Right, which was massive.
An enormous undertaking.
Years and years of investigation trying to untangle how those decisions were made.
And they had access, serious access.
Not just to the public faces, the officials.
But to the classified stuff, the memos, the meeting minutes.
The stuff that doesn't usually see the light of day.
It's about as close as we're going to get to understanding what was going on in the minds of the UK's top brass.
So let's rewind the clock a bit.
Back to early 2002.
9/11 is still fresh. Global tensions are through the roof.
But to really grasp the gravity of the situation,
we need to go back even further.
To understand where things stood with Iraq after the first Gulf War.
Because throughout the 90s, Iraq was under immense pressure.
Sanctions were crippling the economy.
You had the U.S. and the U.K. enforcing these no-fly zones, basically carving up Iraq's airspace.
And of course, the UN weapons inspectors.
Trying to dismantle Saddam's WMD programs.
It was a powder keg waiting to explode.
So this whole idea of containment, can we break that down a bit?
Yeah, so after the Gulf War, containment was the strategy.
Keep Saddam in check.
Prevent him from stirring up more trouble.
But as these documents show, there was a lot of debate about whether containment was even working.
And if so, how to actually make it work.
And those no-fly zones were incredibly controversial, even back then.
For good reason.
Were they even, legal?
That's the thing, and this is where the documents get interesting.
Okay.
They showed that the no-fly zones were never explicitly authorized by the UN Security Council.
Really?
Resolution 688, which you hear about a lot, it condemned Saddam's attacks on the Kurds.
Right.
But it never actually gave a green light to enforce no-fly zones.
So the UK and the US were basically operating in this legal gray area.
Exactly, and that did not go over well internationally.
It just made them look bad.
It undermined their legitimacy.
Yeah. Many countries saw it as a blatant violation of Iraqi sovereignty.
And I imagine it fueled a lot of the anti-West sentiment that was already bubbling under the surface.
Absolutely. It was a huge PR disaster.
And then, of course, there was the Oil for Food program.
Which, in theory, was supposed to ease the humanitarian crisis.
Allow Iraq to sell oil to buy food, medicine, essential supplies.
But in reality...
well, we know how that turned out.
It was riddled with corruption.
Saddam and his cronies basically lining their own pockets.
While ordinary Iraqis continued to suffer.
It's tragic, really.
It is, and these documents confirm that millions of dollars were siphoned away.
It's infuriating.
It really is.
Okay, so we've got sanctions, no-fly zones, humanitarian crisis.
And then you have the UNSCOM inspections.
Which, from what I remember, were a constant source of tension. Absolutely. Imagine the pressure those inspectors were under.
Trying to do their jobs. Verify that Iraq was actually dismantling its WMD programs.
All while Saddam's regime is throwing obstacles in their way left and right.
Hiding documents, blocking access to suspected weapon sites.
It was a constant game of cat and mouse.
So what were the inspectors actually finding during these inspections?
Well, the documents paint a kind of complicated picture, actually.
Right.
On the one hand, there's clear evidence that Iraq had been developing biological weapons.
Yep.
Anthrax, botulinum toxin, nasty stuff.
Right.
And they were hiding it, big time.
Not surprising.
A systematic effort to conceal their programs and materials.
But on the other hand,
there's this growing sense of frustration.
Among the inspectors.
Within the UK government.
Even
like they weren't finding the smoking gun.
The definitive proof that Saddam was an immediate threat.
Exactly. It was more like puzzle pieces than a complete picture.
And that must have made things so much more difficult.
It did. And it fed into this feeling, this growing sense that containment might not be enough.
Which brings us to Operation Desert Fox in 1998.
Right. Those 4 days of U.S. and U.K. airstrikes on Iraq.
What was the immediate trigger for that?
It was a direct response to Iraq blocking those UNSCOM inspections again.
So another escalation in this whole saga.
Exactly. A show of force.
To try and force Saddam's hand.
But it also highlighted how stuck things had become.
That this back and forth wasn't really going anywhere.
And you see this reflected in the documents.
How so?
This growing realization that containment, this policy that had defined the 90s, was becoming unsustainable.
It wasn't a long-term solution,
Not even close.
and then 9/11 happens.
Which changed, well,
So
everything.
the whole world shifted on its axis.
War on terror became the only thing that mattered, and suddenly everything felt a lot more dangerous.
The stakes were higher.
And that fear, that sense of urgency.
It bleeds into everything.
And you see it in these UK documents, too.
In what way?
This laser focus on rogue states.
With WMDs.
The ultimate nightmare scenario.
Right, weapons of mass destruction in the hands of terrorists.
And that's where Iraq, already on thin ice,
Gets pulled back into the spotlight.
Exactly, it was the perfect storm.
And then you have Bush's Axis of Evil speech in 2002.
Oh, yeah, that was a game changer.
Lumping Iraq in with Iran and North Korea.
Basically telling the world, these are the bad guys.
And it worked, didn't it? I mean, it really shaped how people saw Iraq.
Oh, absolutely. It created this whole narrative.
Of Iraq as this existential threat.
And for the UK, it created this immense pressure
To fall in line with the U.S.
to present a united front.
But behind closed doors?
Behind the scenes, it was a lot more complicated than that.
Oh, I bet.
These documents show that.
Lay it on me.
So you had some officials pushing for what they called toughening containment.
Basically turning the screws even tighter.
More sanctions, maybe even using force to enforce the no-fly zone.
A more aggressive approach.
Exactly. But then you had this other camp
Okay.
who were starting to argue for something way more radical.
Which was?
Regime change.
Wow. So from containing Saddam to removing him from power completely.
That was the debate.
And that's a huge leap.
It is. And it wasn't just about strategy either.
There were legal questions, too.
Huge ones.
Like whether it was even legal to invade Iraq.
Exactly. The UK knew that any military action had to be airtight under international law.
Or they'd risk being branded as well.
Or criminals, essentially.
And then there were the key figures driving these discussions.
The personalities involved are fascinating.
Like who?
Well, you've got Tony Blair, the prime minister at the time.
Right, a staunch ally of Bush.
He saw confronting Saddam as, like, a moral imperative.
A hill to die on.
Pretty much. Then you've got Jack Straw, the foreign secretary.
Right.
He was all about the legal justifications for war.
The need for a rock-solid case.
Especially when it came to proving Iraq had WMDs.
Right, that was his focus.
And then there's Jeff Hoon, the defense secretary. More of a pragmatist, you could say.
In the sense that
He was already knee-deep in military planning.
making sure the UK was ready to go.
If or when the time came.
So you've got these huge decisions,
Global
and
ramification
they're being debated by real people.
with their own views, priorities, and levels of risk tolerance.
It's almost like a pressure cooker in those meeting rooms.
It must have been intense.
And it all comes to a head in April 2002,
At the Crawford Ranch,
when Blair visits Bush in Texas.
that meeting was pivotal.
Good cut.
Up until that point, a lot of the talk about military action was hypothetical.
Right.
But at Crawford, Blair basically gave Bush a blank check.
Wow. A promise of unconditional support.
Essentially, the UK was all in.
A huge gamble.
No doubt about it.
So what was the plan at that point? What were they actually thinking of doing?
The details weren't set in stone at Crawford.
Okay.
It was more about signaling that unwavering support.
The U.S. and U.K. standing shoulder to shoulder.
But the documents do suggest a strategy based on an ultimatum.
To Saddam.
Give the weapons inspectors back in, or else.
Or else what?
Well, they didn't spell it out.
But the implication was clear.
Invasion was on the table.
And this is where it gets really unsettling, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because reading these documents, knowing what we know now,
It's like watching a car crash in slow motion.
we know how this ends.
And it's not well.
But even at this stage,
Even in these early stages,
there were cracks.
there were definitely dissenting voices.
People expressing doubt,
Concerns about the intelligence on WMDs.
whether it was reliable.
Worries about the long-term consequences of an invasion.
But those voices
Those voices were often drowned out.
by the rush to war.
It's tragedy, really.
It's hard not to, with all this talk of an unstoppable march towards war,
Right.
to wonder if there were other options on the table.
Like what could have been done differently.
Exactly. Were there people back then saying, hey, maybe we should pump the brakes a little?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
There were definitely voices urging caution, even within the UK government.
Like, what were they suggesting?
Some argued for giving diplomacy more time, you know?
Instead of jumping straight to military action,
Right, let the sanctions keep weakening Saddam's regime.
hoping he'd just crumble from within, basically.
Essentially, yeah, and there were also concerns about international consensus.
That the UK and the US were rushing in without enough support.
That they were going it alone, which never looks good.
So, a more cautious, multilateral approach.
Precisely.
But those arguments, as we know, didn't win out.
Sadly, no.
So why the rush to war? Why was everyone so gung-ho?
Well, it's complicated. The documents point to a bunch of factors.
Like,
Well, there was a huge amount of pressure from the U.S.
to stand with them no matter what.
maintain that special relationship.
Right. Always a factor.
And then there was this genuine belief
Right.
that Iraq was a genuine threat
That Saddam really did have WMDs?
and that he couldn't be deterred.
That he was going to use them?
That was the fear.
A ticking time bomb scenario.
Pretty much. And we know now, of course, that the intelligence was flawed.
To put it mildly.
But at the time, there was this sense of urgency, this feeling that time was running out.
That action had to be taken.
And then, of course, there's the political dimension.
The public pressure.
How history would judge them.
If they didn't act.
It's easy to judge in hindsight.
Yeah, knowing what we know now.
But at the time, they were dealing with a lot of unknowns.
And speaking of unknowns, one of the biggest controversies of the whole Iraq war.
The WMDs.
Exactly, or the lack thereof.
Right. The intelligence was, to put it bluntly, wrong.
And these documents, these declassified files.
They offer a really fascinating insight into how that intelligence was handled.
Okay, tell me more.
The inquiry that produced these documents concluded that the intelligence on WMDs was flawed,
You think?
at best.
Okay.
There was so much pressure to find evidence to support the war.
To justify the invasion.
Exactly. And it seems that, consciously or not,
Judgments were clouded.
assumptions were made.
And the intelligence was basically molded to fit a story they already wanted to tell.
It's a classic example of confirmation bias.
You're looking for evidence that supports your viewpoint.
And ignoring anything that contradicts it.
And in this case, those blind spots had devastating consequences.
Absolutely. And it's a good reminder that intelligence is not always objective.
It can be influenced by political agendas.
And by the desire to please those in power.
So we've talked about the internal discussions, the intelligence failure.
The pressure from the U.S.
But what about the British public? What role did public opinion play in all of this?
Well, these documents suggest that the UK government was very aware of public opinion
They knew they had to be the people along with them
to make the case for war.
to convince them that it was justified.
Yeah.
But there's a difference between listening to public opinion,
And actively shaping it.
which is what they were doing.
To a certain extent, yes.
How so?
Well, they were very careful about how they presented the situation.
Controlling the narrative,
Well, emphasizing the threat from Saddam.
downplaying the risks of invasion.
It was a very deliberate PR campaign.
And it worked.
To a large extent, yes.
Wow. It's just this whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener.
It's been fascinating, hasn't it?
To see how this all unfolded, the decisions, the pressures, the
Yeah.
mistakes,
A lot to process.
it really is. And as we wrap up, I guess the biggest question is,
What did we learn from all of this?
exactly, what are the takeaways?
For me, it's a reminder that history is complicated.
Rarely black and white.
Exactly. There are always so many factors at play.
So many perspectives.
And even with the best of intentions,
Mistakes can happen.
with devastating consequences,
Absolutely. And those mistakes often come with a hefty price tag.
both in terms of human life and global stability.
Yeah, this deep dive into the UK and Iraq has been a sobering experience.
It's easy to judge with the benefit of hindsight,
To say what we would have done differently.
but the reality is these were complex decisions made under immense pressure.
And they continue to shape the world we live in today.
So as we grapple with the legacies of the past,
Let's remember to approach these issues with nuance
to question our assumptions.
and to strive for a more peaceful and just world.